So here we are to do our research ethics workshop today. And workshop means that it's interactive, and we will be discussing soft and hard skills about research ethics when doing Indigenous health research. So I just want to acknowledge myself, the land that I'm on. I'm from the Yellowknife Dene First Nation. So I'm a longtime resident and worker here in Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe territory. And I just want to acknowledge that the land that I live, work, and play on, I've raised my children on, it is Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples have been here for since time immemorial. And I just want to acknowledge that I'm in relationship with them and this sacred land, and how grateful I am, and how much the people in the land have given me and my family. And without the generosity of the people here and what the lands have to offer, I certainly wouldn't be here doing this work. And I'm very grateful for that. So Masi Cho, and I always endeavor to work in reciprocity with those gifts. So Masi Cho. So I know, as academics, we're taught to define terms, and I just want to start out by, everyone hears the word Indigenous. That's the word that's been used politically the last few years by the government. And, where we've come to realize that it's really important is terminology means something. And Indigenous is this blanket term that's been used to refer to the status and non-status First Nations people, Métis peoples, and original peoples from the circumpolar regions in Canada. They call them the Inuit, although that's not even really the correct term by Inuit peoples, languages and customs. I've been schooled to move away from these blanket terms, because having these blanket terms really does not adequately address the distinction-based cultural identities that exist in Canada. So I'm moving away from using a blanket term like Indigenous and actually outright stating First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people instead of using the word Indigenous. And in fact, when we're talking about people, we should really be referring to people based on specific band, nation, culture, community affiliation. So just to let you know that terminology for me is moving away from Indigenous to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. For that reason is because we need to stop colluding with government forces who are trying to take away our identity by giving us these blanket names. Oh, I'm Indigenous. Well, what does that really mean? Not really a lot. Oh, I'm Dene. Oh, I'm Yellowknives Dene. That means a lot more to understanding who I am and what I bring to relationship. So the international context, let's start there. So according to the United Nations, there are actually a lot of Indigenous people from different groups across the world in over 70 countries. All of these groups with unique traditions, cultures, social and political and economic characteristics that are distinct from the dominant societies in which they live. And in Canada, according to the most recent census, there's over 2 million First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people living within the colonial context, and that more than half of these people, our people, are living in urban environments, with youth being the fastest and largest demographic of any population within the country. So that's significant, and that's important to consider. The other thing that's important to consider when we're going to talk about research ethics with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people is to not only consider who are First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people, how many of them are, where are they situated within the global context, what is the background? Well, for all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people across Canada, there is a colonial history and current colonial context that heavily impact what it means to do research. And so that's really about understanding that First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people have experienced multiple colonial aggressions and assaults that have been very personal and invasive in nature. So for instance, education, child welfare, healthcare, segregation, and research have been very specific sites of colonial harms. When I say colonial harms, meaning that these have been systemic. It's not these personal harms that happen, and those do happen, but it's about that there's policies and laws that have been created that have been harmful to First Nations, Métis, and Indigenous people that create personal harms. Today, research and education, and I'm talking about post-secondary education, continues to be sites of systemic and personal oppression for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. Or we could say FNMI to shorten that long mouthful. And I put a happy picture here because, you know, we continue to blossom and grow, and not only survive, but to also thrive, despite this colonial context that we live in. So how did this happen? Some of you may wonder. I mean, most people here probably know, but some people don't know that these oppressions and these systemic harms stem directly from federal legislation. That's what started it all in 1876. And it was started because when Canada as a colonial federal country was begun, the people, the British and the French who were forming legally, you know, forming the title of the country and all the things that they did by their Western colonial system, their British system and French system, said, oh, well, there's already millions of people living here, the Indians, and we need to legally get rid of them because we need to access their land and their natural resources that they have, even though Indigenous First Nations people did not have ownership of land in their culture or their infrastructure way of living in their societies. The Canadian new government decided that they needed to create a law that would get rid of all these people who were already there in order to build the new country. So they created a policy called the Indian Act that had a whole bunch of laws in it that really had one goal, and that was the goal of exterminating the population of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people in order to gain unfettered access to the land and natural resources needed to build the country. So many of these policies have changed or been removed. Many of these policies are still in existence. And the goal of the Indian Act was really to exterminate the population either through assimilation or death. So put everyone in places of extreme deprivation, you know, Indian reserves where they wouldn't be able to thrive, or have them force them to come out and assimilate into dominant society through child welfare, through residential schools, through disenfranchisement, that sort of thing. So you can go and read up on the Indian Act, and it would take a long time to really understand it because it's so big and its impacts. But when we're talking about health, and that's where I've been working for the last 25 years, you know, it's been well substantiated in the literature that colonization has influenced aspects of health in all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities, and are linked to high rates of mental health, physical health, education, and employment challenges. Physical and mental health traumas on FNMI peoples are actually rooted in these attempts at cultural extermination and cause deep set pains in regard to Indigenous identity. So healing and health promotion from the acts of colonization and the harms perpetrated by it have been occurring through reconnection and relationship with current traditional knowledges. And that includes through the use of research. So, you know, one of the greatest harms of colonization and this that has happened through the enactment of all this legislation has been to interrupt the flow of and the transmission of traditional knowledges. So traditional knowledges in terms of how to be healthy, how to live, how to parent, how to be in society, how to relate to each other, how to relate to cosmology, how to relate to the environment, how to relate to spirituality. All of these things have been interrupted through colonization, which essentially made First Nations, Métis, and Inuit cultures and ways of life against the law. So it's only natural that as a result of that, there would be a lot of physical and mental health harms and traumas that we can begin to address through that reconnection with knowledge and relationships with that knowledge through people and other things. So another thing that is talked about when we talk about the colonial context is this concept of intergenerational trauma. And everyone talks about it. It's a well-used word now in society in Canada when we talk about the Indigenous context. And, you know, there's intergenerational trauma and there's the original trauma. So the intergenerational trauma, just to explain it in concrete defining terms, is when an original trauma is transferred to subsequent generations of people through biological, physiological, psychological, environmental, and social means. And that really results in this cross-generational cycle of trauma. I mean, we're talking about it with people, but it also happens with animals. It happens with plants. It's been substantiated in the Western scientific data is real, and we know that it's there from blood memory. So the impact of a stressor on that acute or original trauma is influenced by the person's experience and environment. And we also need to consider collective trauma in the context of a group or community's shared stressors and experiences. And I know that sounds abstract, but our research team has made this great little interactive model to show you how intergenerational trauma works. So when a trauma happens to a person, how they manage and cope with that trauma is based on what happens in their environment, their personal experiences, the history of the group, the social group that they belong to. And these are all mediated by factors like vulnerability in the presence of environmental stressors for new traumas, risk that accumulates across generation for more traumas to happen, unhealthy coping strategies that are modeled intergenerationally, historical events that continue to undermine the well-being of the group, and chronic exposures to ongoing traumas, such as racism, violence, murder, addictions, suicide, all these types of things so these are what mediate and perpetuate intergenerational trauma. Ongoing traumas can also be harms from research, racism in school, all of these things. So you can really see how these all work together. Now, this has been the way of thinking, you know, when I came to be a student. So I first went to graduate school around the turn of the century. So I think it was 2000 or 2001. And at that time, this type of information was not known or accepted outside of Indigenous First Nations, Métis, Inuit communities. In the academy, there was literature and data that blamed Indigenous people for their health problems, didn't accept any connection between colonial history and current colonial acts as impacting the well-being of Indigenous people. And this was not thought of at all. Then as the TRC came onto the scene and the government was forced to acknowledge and take responsibility of this, forced through the international charges of human rights abuse through residential school by the United Nations, this type of idea of intergenerational trauma as being a factor and a real thing that happened to First Nations, Métis, and Indigenous people became prevalent. And that's when I and my research team developed this type of thing to help people understand and be educated about what happened, how it affected us, how did residential school, how did the 60s scoop, how did living on a reserve affect people? And this was created. I think this was created probably about 15 years ago, this intergenerational trauma model that I'm talking about to explain it. Well, now we've moved beyond that. And we've moved beyond to no longer wanting to focus on intergenerational trauma, because that really comes from that deficit lens. We want to focus on intergenerational wellness. And you know what? I start to cry when I think of this, because this comes from our communities who don't want to only be identified as people living with intergenerational trauma. That's not what defines who we are. That's not who we are. We're people who live in continuous healing and strengths that are based in cross-generational education about the colonial past and present, cultural interventions like traditional teachings and healing activities, like having our elder as part of our research team. And, you know, I see in the participants that a number of our traditional knowledge keepers and elders who are on our research teams are here today, part of this. And that's what I'm talking about. And having healing interventions for individuals and communities that are based in traditional knowledges healing, as well as in Western culturally safe interventions. And so this definition of intergenerational wellness really comes from the pillars of healing that lead to resiliency that were published by the Aboriginal Healing Foundation, which is now gone thanks to the Conservative government's cuts in the mid-teens. But that's something we can work on reviving or doing even better. So this has also been called by community partners that I've worked with intergenerational healing, intergenerational wellness, intergenerational strength. And this is an example of using an Indigenous, you know, a First Nations, Métis or Inuit paradigm that is based in a wellness lens in health and research, instead of that Western paradigm deficit lens of Indigenous health. So if we take this same model that we developed about intergenerational trauma and we looked at it from an intergenerational wellness lens, we would place wellness in the center of who we are, not trauma. And we would see that resiliency is fostered and developed by traditional healing and spiritual activities, that access and use of culturally safe and wellness-informed mental health and physical health interventions would be a factor that mediates our wellness. The community cultural events that continue to strengthen the wellness of the group also mediate our wellness, and that healing and wellness accumulates across generations when we focus on these things, and that education about past and present colonization also strengthens and mediates our wellness. Okay, next slide, hang on. So given that this is sort of the context that we're dealing with when we talk about First Nations, Métis, and Inuit research ethics, what tools do we have? Well, we have some great tools. And if you're doing Indigenous research, then I would strongly recommend that you read both of these books. They will help you use what we call Indigenous methodologies. So this is a Cree methodology, research is ceremony, and this is a seminal text in doing research methodologies by Maggie Kovach. So these are very important texts to read if you want to do a study and use an Indigenous methodology. So these are conceptual. These are helping to decolonize your mind and give you an Indigenous way of understanding research methods. Some of the key historical issues when developing research and enacting research that have occurred are that First Nations specifically have been the subject of too much research. And the majority of that research that has been done is initiated, paid for and carried out by non-First Nations people who are from hospitals and universities, as well as governments. And that these researchers have selected subjects of personal or academic interest and disregarded First Nations, Métis, or Inuit priorities. It's safe to say that researchers in health, particularly, I mean, across the board, but I'm talking about health, have really preempted meaningful community involvement by presenting completed research designs, often already funded for community approval rather than collaborating with them from the start. And governments gather administrative and other data from First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities without their knowledge or consent. This continues to happen. And governments and researchers analyze, interpret, and report First Nations, Métis, and Inuit data without consent, approval, review, or input by First Nations, Métis, or Inuit representatives. Still, this has happened and it continues to happen. And in many not isolated, but in many reserve and Inuit communities, people have been actually led to believe that if they don't participate in a research project, they will lose their right to health services. And researchers have not explained their studies in a language or manner adequate to ensure fully informed consent. And we know that though in those cases, it's not because the researchers have these strong, close relationships with communities and participants in which there's trust to give consent. And identity and community-specific research has not been widespread, and concepts and practices of non-distinction-based identity, like Indigenous research has continued to the harm of specific identities. So, meaning we're doing research on a First Nations reserve, and then the conclusions of the data and the study are saying, well, all Indigenous people are this, based on First Nations reserve data, which does not apply to the rest of the people who don't live on that reserve or who are not from that First Nation. Researchers have recklessly sensationalized problems among FNMI communities without regard for the impact on communities or their social and political interests. And, I heard that just this morning on the news. I was watching the national news and I heard them talking about how a court case had been ruled on in violence on a First Nations reserve in Saskatchewan. And then they just had all these other people coming out and saying, everyone has intergenerational trauma, this, that, and the other, which may be true, but that's not the full story. Research focuses on problems without looking at the positive and has often portrayed FNMI people as poor, sick, dependent, violent, and childlike. And that's exactly what I saw on the news this morning. So let's just pause for a second and let me come to the sort of conclusion about what has happened and what is happening with FNMI research and ethics. And basically, many Indigenous researchers in ethics have come to the conclusion that when we use a Western paradigm of research and education, for that matter, with First Nations and Métis and Inuit people, this is actually a form of continued colonial oppression, and it continues to perpetuate intergenerational trauma. When we use Indigenous methodologies, ethics, work with communities to do research, we're perpetuating and supporting intergenerational wellness. So we were supposed to go into breakout rooms to discuss all of this, but apparently there's an issue with Zoom that is not allowing us to go into breakout rooms. And I'm looking to see if if it's been fixed, and I can't do that. But what I'd like to do is just get some reflections from people on what's been shared up to this point, because I really wanted everyone to process. Roy, can you come back? How can people speak other than writing in the chat? Can we allow people to turn on their cameras and ask a question or make a comment?
Okay, let me work on that. Just a second.
Okay, so maybe while we get Roy to do that, if I could ask you kindly to write in the chat. I mean, the idea of this is that someone in the chat understands what's going on. Says, since this is a webinar, not a meeting, all the functionality is disabled. Well, we may be able to change the functionality. I don't know. That's why we have our technical experts there. If you could just type any comments or questions in the Q&A while we wait for Roy to resolve this, then we can go ahead. But I would like to get some comments and questions, feedback from the audience about understanding the context of Indigenous health research and the impacts of intergenerational trauma, intergenerational wellness. So I don't see any comments yet. There's a lot of people here, over 60. So if you have any comments, please put them in the Q&A. So David Berman says, I'm interested in shifting the focus of decolonization to regeneration, from deficits to strengths. Your thoughts? Anyone want to comment on that? Someone says the Emeritus Schwartz, the arrogance of the researchers is amazing. I just want to thank you for this. This is very validating. I often feel very alone and frustrated working within the current mental health and community service sector with the Western lens of illness and pathologizing people. I've been trying to shift and share a wellness perspective for years, but had no idea there were allies and frameworks so well established. It's nice to know I'm not alone. Thank you. As a new First Nations academic and researcher, from an anonymous attendee, can you suggest resources as a place to start, templates and or mentors, etc.? I don't want to reinvent the wheel, and I'd like to approach the research using wise practices. Apparently the participants don't have access to the chat. So Roy, is that how it's supposed to be? Roy's working on that. So I guess the participants only have access to the Q&A. I think another person, Gigi, says, I think the fact that research is being done without focus on what is needed, wanted by the FNMI is insane and most likely being done using public funds. Must be stopped. One more person I'll read from, Anonymous. How do university ethics facilitate what Suzanne is asking for, and might those be best required in any research that is asking to engage with Indigenous peoples? Currently, if the researcher is not publishing, the Indigenous unique guidelines are not required. And I'm ready to be wrong on that. That's a good question. Last one, I will read Michael Brown. The deficit lens really worries me in terms of how Indigenous studies are being taught in schools, as my younger sister is currently taking Indigenous studies class in high school, and I'm concerned that the narratives being taught are continuing harms that were discussed so eloquently here today. Gigi, how can we ensure this stops? Sue Lemire, the work the research team has done is amazing. Jean Mitchell Steele, reflecting on this topic, I'd like to share as an Indigenous social worker on healthcare that when it comes to research, consent is so vital and that consent can change during the research process. Also, I see many non-Indigenous researchers doing health research. What are your thoughts on this? And the last one, because I don't want to leave anybody out, those of us from Marina Ford, those of us in the Indigenous community are aware of these issues, and they have been widely reported in news platforms and social media. Why is nothing moving forward? Why is nothing changed? Oh, gee, more keep coming. One more I'll read. Monica Goddard. I want to say message hope for all of this. I feel a connection with coming also from YK Dene First Nation, growing up in Dilo. And last one, from David Berman. Also, colonialism has been a tragedy not only for FNMI, but for the health of Mother Earth and hence for the survival of all of us. We all need to be allies toward the eighth fire. Okay, that is fantastic. Thank you. I love hearing that, and I apologize that people can't speak. I asked to have this set up so we could put people into breakout rooms, but that didn't happen. And Roy is saying now in the webinar chat, but I don't know, it says only the host and panelists can see that. It says I can allow individuals to talk, and he's going to let Pamela speak. So you can do that now, Roy? I think Pamela, can we hear you? I can see you, so.
You can see me and hear me?
And hear you, yes, yay.
Oh, I didn't need to raise my hand
Okay.
or whatever,
Please.
but unmute does work. But I didn't have a question. I was just here to listen to your great presentation.
Oh, but your hand is raised, so that means you don't have, you want to speak?
No,
Okay.
I'm good. Thank you so much.
Okay. Okay. So Roy, you could also bring everyone on to the panel. I guess that would be another way to, but I don't, you could also bring everyone into the panel and that would allow them to speak when we get to the next question. Would that work? You problem solve that and I'll keep going. So those were some great questions and comments. And, you know, the thing is, and yes, I will be able to answer most of those as we go on, because there are some great resources out there. And that's what I'd like to do is, you know, I've highlighted how we got into this place, what the sort of ethical issues are, some of them with Indigenous health research, and what some of the resources are. So the sort of Bible of ethical Indigenous research would start with decolonizing methodologies. And this one on the left is what I read. I think it was in 99 when I first found it. And I felt like everything that I thought had been validated at that moment when I read this book. Now there's a third edition by Linda Smith. And I would urge you to run out and read it and highlight and note as much as you can from it, because this is, you know, what has really helped us to start to shift the paradigm in the institutions as far as research goes. Other responses to all of these problems that I've suggested are issues have also come starting in 2007 with the development of the what are known as the OCAP principles: ownership, control, access, and possession of research that was developed by the National Aboriginal Health Organization and now has been taken over by FNIGC. So if you Google OCAP or you go to this link, you will get a copy of this. And this is one of these guidelines that was developed in response to these problems and issues to manage the ethical harms of research with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities, but more with Aboriginal. That was the blanket term back then changed to Indigenous. And as I said earlier, we're trying to no longer use blanket terms. So we want to say First Nations, Métis, or Inuit communities. So this is one of those resources that can be used at a general level. Another general level resource is Chapter 9 of the TCPS2. Now that's the federal government research funding granting agencies guideline for ethical research with Indigenous people. And you can Google that. TCPS2 Chapter 9 was updated in 2022. I do have information that the federal government, that is the branch of the federal government that mediates this, and that's the CIHR, that from the Tri-Council of Research, is aware that this is out of date and not relevant and needs to be updated. They just have no idea how to update it. And people like all of us people here need to go to them and say, you know what, these are the issues and this is what has to be addressed. And that's what we're going to do over the next few years, hopefully. So those are kind of the OCAP principles, and the TCPS 2 Chapter 9 are the two sort of national guiding frameworks for ethical research with Indigenous people. But I'll have you know that some universities have also developed their own guidelines for ethical Indigenous research that are either general, like the UVic here has developed protocols and principles for general Indigenous research. Thompson River University is using a distinction-based approach, which is better. They are using the research ethics guidelines of the First Nation on which their university sits, and that's great. This is just a photo, so you can't, oh wait, sorry, can't click on it. But you can Google this up, Thompson River TRU research ethics guidelines, and you can click on this PDF and you can get this document. So, and I like what they said here about honoring reconciliation and acknowledging the First Nations people who are in the territory of where their university is and why they are working with them and embedding the research ethic guidelines into their research protocols at their university. That would be great. And I'm sure it's not a perfect process or it's not enforced, but it's a good start. One of the issues I think it's important to note about all of these guidelines and protocols is they are just guidelines and protocols. There is no requirement by any university, by any funding body, by any government or lawmakers that says these have to be used. Many researchers continue to apply to CIHR and other government granting agencies and get money without following TCPS Chapter 9 requirements for ethical Indigenous research. Many researchers get money from other branches of the government that don't follow Indigenous ethical guidelines or protocols such as these. So the system is not supporting ethical research. So who does that fall on? Us. It falls on the individuals being harmed by research or the individual researchers who want to do better, whether we're Indigenous or non-Indigenous. So there's these national guidelines, the OCAP and the the TCPS2, then some universities have guidelines, and I don't know all which universities do, not many. U of T definitely does not. And then there's some culturally or community specific frameworks for ethical research. So for instance, here, Six Nations has their own research ethics protocol. And I pulled this off the internet. You can go look it up, and it's great. The Manitoba First Nations Leadership Community Agency has their own ethical guideline for research. And then whoops, sorry, I don't know how to work this thing. And then the Haudenosaunee also have, this is a Cree ethical protocol for research also exists here. So these are for these specific communities. So that's wonderful. Some community agencies have their own ethical frameworks that have been developed, like the Mi'kmaq group has their own ethics protocols and guidelines. So that's what we need to work towards. We also have national Inuit and Metis frameworks that have been developed. The National Inuit Strategy by ITK and the Principles of Ethical Métis Research. And I know different Métis nations like across the country have also developed their own principles of ethical research. So it's very important to connect with that. If you're doing Métis community research, you wouldn't use a First Nations framework or guideline for research ethics with the Métis community or an Inuit community. You would use the ethical guidelines from that specific community. And if that community hasn't developed the ethical guidelines, then you would work with that community to talk about what ethical guidelines they want to adopt for the research you're doing. Roy, do you have something to say? No? Yes?
Sorry, I was just checking to see if the chat's working now.
In the Q&A, it says, no, the chat's not working. It says chat disabled. You have to go in the Q&A to see that.
Okay, I'm still working on it. I don't know why it's not working, but
That's okay. We'll keep going. I will keep going with the presentation. So these are some of the resources that exist. And that was one of the questions. Where do you go? So you've got the national frameworks, you've got the university or community agency or First Nations specific frameworks. You've got Inuit and Métis guidelines and national or community frameworks. So now we're at the group discussion part. So I was hoping that people could go into breakout groups, breakout rooms for this. And or at least if we can't go into breakout rooms, have a large group discussion. Roy, is there any way that people can be in a large group discussion where they can actually speak? Roy's not answering. So I guess let's just use the Q&A to respond to these questions. I feel sad that we can't have an interactive discussion because I am a very interactive person, and I feel like that's where the true power of any type of workshop is in the relationships we build and have with each other. So just a quick question to all of you. So can everyone here see the Q&A? Or is it only the panelists who can see the Q&A? Oh, David says we should close this session and reopen as a meeting. That's a great idea. I could just do that if you like. I could, or actually I shouldn't try to do that. Anytime I try to do anything detailed or technical, something bad happens. Maybe Roy, do you think that you could just open a Zoom meeting and send everyone who's here an invite to a regular Zoom meeting?
I could try, but we're recording it right now.
We'll just have to stop recording and start re-recording then, and you can piece them together.
Okay,
Would that be okay with everyone? So we'll just leave here and Roy will email you all just a link to a regular Zoom meeting. Everyone, all of us, just a regular Zoom meeting. And then we can all see each other and talk. Hi, yay, everybody got back. Thank you for your patience and thank you, Roy, for your hard work. Thanks for the great idea, David. Okay, so now that we're all here, if anyone wants to speak or say something, please unmute and or turn on your camera at your level of comfort. So I'm going to put back the discussion questions. Hang on, let me get
Let
back.
me see if I can find an answer to the question. Okay.
Here we go. Okay, get back to the questions. Here we go. So, what have you observed in academic First Nations, Métis, in your research?
It's my mouse.
Oh, if you're
No.
just everyone, please remember to mute
I
unless
really
you're
could
going
have
to
done
talk.
this before I started this video.
Somebody has
Um,
not muted. There we go. What have you observed in academic First Nations, Métis, Inuit research? Specifically, what have you observed processes or actions on the part of academic researchers? And do you think land, do you think of land as cultural appropriation in dominant society? And how is this linked to research? So anyone who wants to respond to either of these questions, you can just start talking. Now no one wants to talk. What have you observed in academic research? Do you think of land as cultural appropriation in dominant society, and how is this linked to research?
Okay, is it okay if I chime in for a second?
Yes, anyone, just introduce yourself.
Sego Sewa Gwego, Giselle ni Yungets, Oshwiga ni Dwagenun, Scarborough Giderun. Hello everyone, my name is Giselle. I'm from Six Nations Grand River, that's my band, but I grew up off reserve. I'm Ganyakihaga or Mohawk, and I come from a mixed background. On my father's side, we are mixed Indigenous, so we lead our lives as Mohawk first, we're Haudenosaunee first, but my grandmother also is Bodwodmi from Pine Creek Reserve in Michigan, and my grandfather, he's Boricua, so Indigenous to Puerto Rico, also known as Taino, and my mother, just Japanese from Yokohama. So that's a bit of my background, and I grew up off reserve, usually just traveling a lot. My hopes were to become a medical doctor. My family has experienced a lot of medical violence, including myself. And so I wanted to come to U of T because it's also closer to my community, and I also have family there around the area. My grandmother used to work with Niswebeek, Peggy Smith. My granduncle, his name's Pat Green. He actually recommended me to you, Suzanne Stewart. And I'm a U of T student. And so I've been hoping to get into medicine, and I've been trying to be wary of how much of our community has faced this medical violence, has faced violence in research as well. And there needs to be a lot of reconciling to begin with, in the fact that a lot of folks in my family especially don't feel comfortable with receiving healthcare from clinics, things like that, because of the large disconnect. Another thing I've really noticed is that amongst the U of T campuses, there's a very concerning amount of pretensions as well as uninformed consent, not only for participants of research, but as well as myself, what exactly I'm getting into. You know, people change promises last minute, and at the end, I've been tokenized for my experiences here. And I also realized a lot of the income coming from the research that is being conducted on my campus and throughout the other 3 campuses, as well as the grants, cause a lot of folks to manipulate their wording and manipulate how they conduct their research so it's not completely truthful. And so with this incentive of grants, funding, who gets what, how it's going to be placed within this research, and to their participants and the researchers themselves, trying to navigate that. Just if there's any tips on that, as well as, you know, receiving grants, who to look out for. I don't know if I can really, sorry, I kind of muddied what I was asking, but there's like a lot of pull of grants that a lot of researchers who may not be using it with the best intent are trying to gain and end up gaining those grants. And they usually try and tokenize a lot of the Indigenous students, community, and staff, and use us as like a stepping stool, using names without our consent in writing up for these grants, using pictures without consent, a lot of this. How can someone like me, or just really anyone, navigate those kinds of spaces? How can we create our own research groups where we can better conduct this with better intentions? Right now, it feels pretty impossible. And so that's kind of where I'm at now.
Thank you so much for your comments, observations, and questions. And, you know, just to kind of summarize, so it sounds like what you've shared, and thank you for your courage in sharing, is that you've seen a lot of research being conducted within Indigenous research being conducted without integrity, and you're not really sure how to navigate that so that you're not you don't have to be part of that, but you still want to do research and do it in a good way, in a community way. And I would say how to do that. Well, there are a few ways. So working with other people who are doing good research is a great example. And I see some people on this call who are some people that I work with who are great people to work with. So if you know of any professors or graduate researchers or new career researchers who are doing stuff that you think is good, call them up, email them, drop by, ask them if you can work with them and learn from them. I think that's great. Also working with knowledge keepers, you know, actively doing that. We have a bunch of knowledge keepers who work on campus at U of T. There's also great Indigenous graduate student supports and resources that have been developed and are still being developed across the country. So, you know, we have the Ontario Indigenous Mentorship Network for graduate students, and we have those regional Indigenous mentorship networks across Canada, in every region, in every province. Universities also usually have undergraduate and graduate student groups. There was a couple at U of T. I don't know if those are still going since the pandemic. Pardon me, but I think those can be accessed through First Nations House at U of T. And like I said, just reaching out to Indigenous or non-Indigenous professors who are doing good work that you like and respect, and asking them if you can work with them. I think that would probably be your best bet.
Yeah.
So I hope that answers your question.
Just to quickly add one more thing. With my experiences, I am also having to deal with folks who are in higher positions of superiority who are leading these research projects with not a good intent. And so having, as a student, having to bring that forward to a board who doesn't really want to listen to what you have to say, as well as, you know, denote your experiences, completely disregard it, is a better word, because this other person has more experience and friendship with a board than a student does. I noticed that a lot. There's a lot of difficulties, not just for myself, but for other students as well. It's just almost feels draining that there's a lot of these barriers that are brought up.
Yeah, absolutely. There can be barriers, and so trying to find people that you can work with that you know are good and sticking with them could be helpful with that, as well as these student groups. I would recommend contacting the Ontario IMN. If you just Google Ontario Indigenous Mentorship Network, their website will come up. So we have two other people, Laura and Sunila. I don't know who wants to go first. You guys, Lori, Lori.
Hi there, my name is Lori. I will try to just be very quick. I feel like I'm one of the many sort of lost people. So my grandmother, Anishinaabe from Alderville First Nations, you know, much like our collective story, my history has been very shameful and secretive and disconnected. And it's only been in my last, I'm 50, I don't mind sharing, in my last, say, 40s, I've been trying to reconnect and make sense of it and assimilate it into my work. I've worked within mental health and community services for 25 years. And so I've spent much of my life feeling like I don't belong. I don't belong in Indigenous community, of course, authentically. I don't belong really in sort of Western. I feel very not at home within Western colonized environments. And I was raised with values that are more in line with Indigenous. But again, I've been very disconnected. So thankfully, I have many Anishinaabe friends and colleagues who've been so welcoming and have tried to share. But back to your question around the what I've observed. So I think not just in research, but in literally every system and structure known. I feel like it's, you know, Giselle, you talked a lot about some kind of overt, you know, behaviors and actions and things that go on. But I think what has been profound for me is the covert and sort of insidious and buried layers as well that are almost like so overwhelming. Sometimes I can't breathe with that. And it's in things like the definitions and the frameworks and the structures and even in the language. And I know myself, even in my early explorations in trying to understand this, both academically and applied ways in the community, you know, again, I have very many Anishinaabe friends and colleagues who have been so patient with me where I'd be saying, but what does this mean? And describe it to me. And they would joke and say, oh, that's your Western thinking. Like you're trying to categorize and I didn't even realize how sort of layered that is. And so it's a little like hearing a bell ring. Once you hear it ring, you can't unring it. I see that throughout research, throughout frameworks, throughout education, throughout our service system, and it's overwhelming. So I think being able to shift it. I don't know how, right? Because I know there's two schools of thought. Some school of thought say we have to learn how to sort of work within those frameworks, and others that are like down with the frameworks. Let's rebuild something new. So I just want to acknowledge that I think it's actually very, very deep in research and not always ill. Maybe I'm being optimistic. I'm not always sure there's ill intent. I think there's a lot of people out there trying to understand, but also just trapped within, you don't know what you don't know. And then just quickly with the land, I think it ties back to that idea of entitlement, sort of this ownership. You know, we were talking in one of my leadership classes in my, I'm doing my master's in education currently, and we were talking about this idea of ethics and how, you know, all definition of ethics when we're talking about ethics seem to still be grounded in human to human, and they just completely miss ecological sacredness and So I think it's incomplete, and I think that ties into some of the land pieces. So try to keep it brief. It was a lot of information. I hope that shares some perspective.
Thank you so much for sharing, Lori. That was really rich and very honest and courageous. So merci cho for that. And I do like what you were saying about the land. And that was why I put that question in there, was to try to get people to start thinking about, you know, because Indigenous ethics are supposed to be applied when there's anything to do with Indigenous people, but is not the land part of Indigenous identity and Indigenous cosmology? So if that is the case, then wouldn't any research involving the land be subjected to Indigenous research ethics? That's kind of where I'm trying to start the percolator of up here going. So sorry, I can't see anything small with my reading glasses. Sunila.
Yes. Hi, Suzanne. We had connected long time back. So just a brief
I
introduction.
remember, yes.
So yes, so I'm a U of T alumna, and this is a wonderful, wonderful opportunity to come back. But I work in Fort Smith Northwest Territories at Aurora College, and that's our connection essentially. And actually, I work in research ethics. My title is Manager Research Ethics and Regional Programs. I moved here in territories about 3 years back, but I'm still a Torontonian. No, I pay taxes here, so I'm still trying to be between the two worlds. But kudos to you. And like, you know, last year also I attended some of the things. I just wanted to give you a quick update on number of learnings which we are absorbing, and we are not perfect. I'm talking from me as a research ethics person, me as a research, like I'm among many things, I'm a board of director for CAREB, which is Canadian Association of Research Ethics Board. But more importantly, I'm learning from the research which gets conducted in territories in various parts. So I just want to give you the quick update on the land thing, and want to give a shout out to Kelsey Wrightson from Deshinta. Last year we had, like we in the territories are blessed to have number of studies, and we are the only post-secondary institution. So if it is ethics and if it involves human subjects, it comes to our door, and then we have to say yeah or nay or whatever. So it's a very bad position to be in, depending on where you are. But we were able to advocate and say that please do not look at human subjects only as compartmentalized. It should be looked at, Chapter 9 should be looked at a little more widely, and land, water, animal, environment along with humans, because we are not separate. We have been trying to advocate it, and this is positive. So that's what I'm sharing. Somebody someplace is at least listening. So I have talks with Margaret Blakeney of TCPS. People are very aware that chapter 9 needs to be updated, and you rightly said, but we can talk all about it. And let me tell you, I'm not expert, but we have gone through a number of things related to land, our recent experience with wildfires, and number of things associated with it. So we live this. But coming back to Kelsey and her Deshinta, so I had invited her for the way they do on the land programs. And one of the things they introduced was taking permission from land and doing a ceremony before even we do anything. And I'm very glad to inform that we love that, and quite a number of environmental related studies, which are, I'm not allowed to name names, but which are coming from governmental organizations, we could push that. And that is something I'm very happy to report that that's one of the processes or tools or techniques. And all kudos to Deshinta for that. That's it, Masicho.
Thank you so much, Sunil. I really appreciate you sharing that, and that, because that's so important. And I think that's really where a lot of this discussion has been lacking, and there's been a big gap in understanding that by the academic research community. So I'm just going to go back to the presentation because we're only have 15 minutes left, and we'll reserve our questions and comments for any more till the end. So, you know, the sort of where we're heading is that research has to be reconceptualized and practiced to emphasize empowerment rather than oppression, because a lot of research has been oppressive. And in fact, less than 5% of researchers who do FNMI research actually have any specialized training in Indigenous research methods or any knowledge of Indigenous languages or paradigms. So, you know, that means that research continues to be nothing more than cultural tourism to benefit the tourists, who are, of course, the researchers and their audience. And First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities continue to lack control of research processes and results, because there's actually no unified or required guideline or methodology for these ethical violations. And that's what I mentioned earlier. So that's kind of what the current situation is. One of the really big issues is data sovereignty. Data governance and data sovereignty are the sort of are the salient issues in research right now, ethical issues. And, you know, people are like, what does that mean? Well, I found a really good definition of what data sovereignty is. And that came from the Simon Fraser University Research Data Management. So you can go look that up. And that's really about understanding that Indigenous people have the right to control, own, access, and take care of the data about their lands, communities, culture, people. And these data and information management have to be determined and mediated by cultural practices of people who are involved in the data. So this means that people who are represented in the data, like you know, participants, community organizations, they have to actually be partners, not subjects, or even partners is even too passive of a word. You know, so these are things that need to be considered in data sovereignty that haven't been. Okay, how am I doing this? There we go. So what are some resources for addressing the important ethical issue of data sovereignty? Well, there's a great book written by our Maori colleagues, Indigenous Data Sovereignty. You should read that. Also, there's been international principles developed for Indigenous data governance by Indigenous scholars from all around the world, including Canadian scholars. So here's you can just Google CARE principles for Indigenous data governance. Here's the actual website, and they have all kinds of resources aside from this data governance model. So these are great things, resources to start to use. Some of the other current issues are around that come up when we try to address these is who Indigenous groups and appropriate authorities are is not really clear, especially when we get off reserves. Even on reserves, it's problematic. Big data continues to be a challenge for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit populations, especially in health and education. And research on strengths and solutions from the Indigenous paradigm continues to be lacking. There continues to be also this lack of capacity for Indigenous research in both academic and community settings. And that's because universities and hospitals are not safe spaces for our people to work, learn, or be. So this is systemic. So what do we know for sure after all this? Well, we know that community partnerships and ethical principles are very important to any study, but because of the colonial context and the knowledge appropriation, people remain suspicious of research and researchers. Therefore, having these strong, respectful relationships based on Indigenous values like reciprocity are what creates valid and ethical data. You know, another solution is really that there has to be a shift in the paradigm of research to address all of these issues away from these Western paradigms of knowledges and research and ethics. And basically First Nations, Métis and Inuit research has to be priorities for universities. So that means that in all of these institutions, they need to have an FNMI research strategy. There should be an FNMI vice president or provost at the central admin of the research. There need to be associate deans of FNMI research in each school, and we need to hire more Indigenous people. There aren't enough, and that's, you know, that's part of the attrition, is keeping us down so that, you know, we get overwhelmed and we can't do this work. So I guess ultimately, you know, this culture conflict between Western methodologies and Indigenous knowledges of ethics and practices has to be addressed and resolved at the policy level. And what else do we need to do? Well, that was where I want to turn it over to you. But since we have only 10 minutes left, we're not going to do that because we don't have time. And I'm going to share with you a few more sort of nuggets of help in terms of how do we negotiate research ethics boards as Indigenous researchers. And, you know, the way to do that is I've developed some systematic steps. So we'll make this presentation available to you. So we want, as people who are wanting to do ethical Indigenous research, what do we do and how do we get it through ethics, an ethics board at a university? Because this is a whole nother pragmatic problem that we deal with. So step one is we create a research proposal using an FNMI methodology and a Western academic framework. So right there, double the amount of work. These are some examples of good Western academic research proposals that I found that I use myself and I encourage students to use. Then in addition to that, you can choose one of these Indigenous or FNMI methodologies. So I'm Dene. So I like to use Indigenous knowledges, Dene knowledges, to structure a research proposal. I've also, since I work in Anishinaabe territory with a lot of Anishinaabe people, we've used Anishinaabe values and principles, such as 7 grandfather teachings, as the actual methodology to our research, citing them. We can cite Yomoria's laws, the Great Dene's laws. We can cite the 7 grandfather teachings. We can cite the Haudenosaunee Great Laws, the laws of the Longhouse. We can cite anything that we want that is based in Indigenous knowledges, whether it's written in a book or told by an elder. And that's what's really important in creating the research proposal. Then you want to get all the appendices you need for your research proposal, like your partnership letter, your OCAP certification. Remember, we talked about that. That's a national guideline. You take a course, you get a certificate saying you've been educated in OCAP. For data collection tools, for data analysis method steps, recruitment posters, recruitment script, consent forms. You get all these appendix to your research proposal that are all done using Indigenous methodologies and Western methodologies. And you're going to format them with your community partner helping you to put everything that's in there, your community partners. And you're going to ensure that every appendix, like all these, are formatted in a way that shows the name of what the document is, the version 1, version 2, the date it was created. You're going to ensure that on every appendix to do with your research proposal, including the research proposal title page, has the name and the logo of the Indigenous community partner you're working with, so that it's clear and there's transparency about who's there, and that information is on everything, every piece of paper to do with the research. And then you're going to also make sure that you have all of those appendices and extra documents on the side in Word so that you can revise them. And when you're ready to submit it, you're going to fill it all out on the online portal, and you're going to cut and paste directly from this proposal with all the appendices that you've made using Indigenous methodologies. And you're going to send a copy of it to your community partners, whoever those are, so they have it. You've submitted an REB application, you're sending it to your community partner while you're waiting to get approval back. Once you get approval, then you're going to send them the final copy that was approved, as well as the approval certificate. So there's transparency, because that's part of an ethical research, transparency, communication. And one important thing to remember, and this is probably the most important piece of advice that I never got, that I learned from trial and error, is that REB reviewers are not usually informed or educated about any Indigenous research ethics issues or needs. Sorry. So don't be afraid to respond to these comments that are really based only in Western ethical guidelines. So some of the comments and questions that I've got that I had to respond to, I've been told, oh, $50 is too much of an honorarium to give to a participant. You can't do that. That's coercive. You know, when I'm giving an elder a $250 honorarium, a youth $100 honorarium, you know, I have to explain to them that holders of Indigenous knowledges need to be honored and respected at the same level as Western experts do. Otherwise, I've had research ethics applications rejected because my honorariums are too much, or because I'm using tobacco to give to people. You know, these people on these boards who are evaluating these applications often don't know. And if you get stuff back that you feel stumped out, ask for support from a mentor or colleague. Another quick thing I come back from all the time is that community members, that is non-academic team members. So we have community research assistants, we have staff from our community partners on our research team doing the research with us. That's how it remains ethically community grounded. Ethics says if they're not an academic student or a professor or an academic researcher at the university, they're not allowed to work with the data. Well, that's just plain ridiculous. So that's another thing that has to be explained and dealt with. So it's kind of like, you know, you're up against something that is giving you permission for something it doesn't even understand. So be aware that that's the context right now. So the final conclusion really is that there's models, there's guidelines, there's protocols out there for research ethics, and these are not always helpful, especially for people who are not already practicing in a culturally safe way or understand how to build partnerships and relationships. So therefore, you know, current guidelines and protocols, just because you're using them does not mean the research is going to be ethical, does not equal ethical research. Because ethical research comes down to the integrity of the person and the quality of the relationship. And ticking off boxes isn't going to ensure that. It's more than that. So, Masi Cho, thank you so much for all of your time. We have 3 minutes left. So if anyone wants to say anything quickly, you have like maybe 30 seconds if multiple people want to speak. So let me, you know, just put your hand up, and there's my contact information if you need it. Please just put your hand up or unmute if you want to say something. If you have a comment. Go ahead, please. Can't hear anyone.
It's Gigi. Just wanted to quickly say thank you for this learning opportunity. Appreciate it.
Miigwech. Anyone else?
Hi, Suzanne.
Sorry.
Thanks for, I know
Oh,
I've
very
only been here for a little bit of time, but really appreciated what I heard about land and ethics, you know, questions around use of land, and then somebody put, well, what if the land says no? Love it. So lots of food for thought. Thank you. Nice to see you.
I love it. Thank you, Raven.
I think all researchers need to understand that their life depends on the health of the land. And if they don't get it, then they're going to continue to oppress.
Aho.
Oh, I just want to say to me, and thank you. Lots of food for thought. I was just going to ask, so will there be additional links? Because I know I missed a couple being in the other room. Like as far as the PowerPoint goes?
Yeah,
That'll be made available?
it'll be posted on our YouTube channel. Please go on there and watch all of our
on the YouTube channel.
up our numbers. We got lots of videos on our YouTube channel. If you search up Waakebiness
We're
Institute.
seeing that OCAP link.
Yep, so please go. And so Clayton, can I invite you to do our closing, please?
Yeah. Just a few words, I guess. As you're all, there's what Dr. Suzanne has talked about, both methods of research and everything, and I just, what is the goal again, right? Just to point that out, right? The goal is to heal the self, right? And I was thinking when everybody was talking and when Suzanne was talking, I was thinking of my father who was passed, right? And some of you knew him. Some of you liked him and some of you didn't. And that's okay, because he was this guy who came out of a horrible experience, right? And he's that generation came out of the residential schools, right? All of this. And he could have went this way, he could have went that way. And he used to tell me this. He says, "I'm nobody special, son. I'm just, I've done some horrible things," right? And I was, and all of this stuff. And I hurt a lot of people because I didn't know any better. I didn't know who I was. I had no idea. But I know how I healed myself. I went back. It took a tremendous courage, because by then he could have went either way. He could have became institutionalized, right? Went to prison, this and all of this stuff. He was an alcoholic. He was a heroin addict. He was everything. All of that. He was of that generation, and he was no one special, he used to tell me. But the thing that saved me, and the research he did, ceremony. That's what saved his spirit. That's what saved him. That's what he did. And so many of those people of that generation did all that. They didn't have, and some didn't make it and some did. But he was of that generation who did all the work for us, right? And fought civil rights, human rights, etc. Did everything. And so he sat in ceremony, and it wasn't his doing. It was my mother, right? Who said, if you want to have a life, with me, then you're going to have to do this, right? And so he stepped into ceremony. It took a tremendous amount of courage. He talked about that later, how terrified he was of the sweat lodge, how terrified, because he felt he wasn't worthy, right, to sit in that place. He felt that he told me that he said, all the horrible things he did to himself and to others because of the trauma, right? All of this. And so he told me this, and then he said, I went in there and I healed myself, right? I found myself, and I became, later in life, he became this man who ran a sweat lodge. He became a healer. He helped, he served, right? My whole point is really, the research is about, there was a time when we weren't allowed to practice. There was a time when we were allowed to do anything. And the research all points to, this is the only way that we are going to heal ourselves, because we're all finding all the tribes are finding their original instructions again, and how to live a good life. Everything, right? And some will speak the language, and some will do this, and some will become this, and all of this, and some won't, right? But the point is that the next generation, that's our children, that's our grandchildren, right? They have everything to heal themselves, right? Because of all the hard work that you're doing, each one of you, everyone, all the work that we're doing. So our children will get to a place where our children will be healthy, beautiful human beings again, right? That's what we're working towards. Right? That's what I'm working towards. That's what I've dedicated myself to my granddaughter, right? Everything. We're all doing that. It's the most important thing. And that was that my father's generation that did all that, right? Did all the work for us. So I acknowledge them. They're called elders. I'm not an elder, so don't ever call me one, all right? So I'm just a guy who's trying to be a practitioner and trying to heal myself, right? Because I still have the residue of my father's trauma, right? All of this. I don't know if that will ever go away, but I'm going to try. But I know how it works. I know what makes me a better person, and that is our way of life, our culture, our medicines, our everything, our ceremonies. Ceremony is research, right? And this is what we practice at Waakebiness, and this is what we quote. Ceremony is research, right? To heal ourselves. It's up to us, and we can do it now, and we're getting better. So I want to thank Dr. Suzanne for all the work she has done, everything, and all the other researchers are out there, right? Doing all that work for us. So I take a moment or two in this language. I say miigwech.